We're looking at two landscapes here. On the red plate, this is a degraded landscape. It's flour as a stand-in for a degraded landscape, which is dirt, sand, silt, and clay, broken up rocks. On the green plate is bread, and it's a stand-in for a healthy landscape. It's sand, silt, clay, and biology. Super important. Let's see what happens when we rain on these landscapes. Pouring water into a rain cloud, of course. And the rain cloud is causing erosion. The rain is causing erosion. We see some runoff. There appears to be flooding. The color of that water indicates that the soil itself, or the landscape, is now a part of the water system. We have dry places all over the landscape, but yet there's flooding. This seems to be flooding and drought at the same time. If we were a plant in this landscape and there was a drought and places did not get water, it would be dry at the bottom. So let's see. We find a totally dry plate on the bottom. So if we're a plant in this landscape, our roots would not have just gotten a drink. We would be thirsty. Flooding, drought in the same place, poor water quality. If you were farming or gardening in this landscape or adding any type of household chemicals to this landscape, those would now be in the waterway. Let's see what happens when we rain on a healthy landscape. On the bread. The water is infiltrating into the sponge of the soil. It's soaking in like a sponge. Those pore spaces that hold the bread out are happening because yeast is the magic ingredient in bread, which is the biology in bread. That's what makes air spaces those organisms breathe. Those pores are held together in landscapes by the goose glues, snots, and slimes that are produced by biological soil organisms that live all throughout the soil landscape. Let's see what happens when we rain twice as much on this landscape, since we didn't see any flooding from the first rainstorm. These pore spaces make up about half of the space of soil, and they are where the air is in soil. It's where water can infiltrate into soil, and that air and water, along with photosynthesis and the sugars made by plants, sustain microbial life in the soil. So twice the amount of water, and we still have no flooding in this landscape. I'm going to pour a little more because I'm really trying to reach saturation here. Saturation will happen when we start to see water flow out from the bottom of this landscape, indicating that the water is going through the soil to the base layer. Soil is a filter, healthy soil. Biological organisms and chemical interactions with those organisms in the soil, in these pore spaces, in the sponge, actually clean water. If you had to live in these landscapes, would you choose the flour or the bread if you were a farmer? If you were growing plants of any kind, you would likely choose the bread. The bread is wet all the way through. We have full saturation. If these landscapes were out in hot, hot, sunny conditions for days after this rainstorm, this one would evaporate and get covered with a hard, crusty surface, would not take in water the next time it rained. This one would get a little stale on the outside, so to speak, because it's bread, and down in the middle you would still have some moisture, so organisms and plants in this landscape would still be able to get a drink. If you had to build a house in one of these landscapes, you would likely choose the bread. Your house here might be in the waterway. If you had to get water from natural sources in one of these landscapes, you would likely choose the bread because you might be able to find it after it rained and you would want to drink it as opposed to this right after a rainstorm.